Hello and welcome to episode 207. It is a pleasure today to be joined by Ursula Villarreal-Moura. Ursula is the author of Math for the Self-Crippling, which is right here, which was published in 2022, selected by Zinzi Clemens as the Gold Line Press Fiction Contest winner, and Like Happiness, which comes out with Celadon Books in 2024. A graduate of Millbury College, she received her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College and was a VONA/Voices Fellow. Her stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in numerous magazines, including Tin House, Catapult, Prairie Schooner, Midnight Breakfast, Washington Square, Story, Bennington Review, Wigleaf Top 50, and Gulf Coast. She contributed to Forward, 21st Century Flash Fiction, a flash anthology by writers of color, and in 2012, she won the Cutbank Big Fish Flash Fiction/Poetry Prose Poetry Contest. Her writing has been nominated for Best of the Net, Best Small Fictions, a Pushcart Prize, and long listed for Best American Short Stories 2015. Ursula, good afternoon. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. That's the dream, right? Is to get into the Best American Short Stories.
Yeah, I just got longlisted, so I can't say I'm there
Oh,
yet,
that
but
counts. That counts.
I flip to the back whenever I see that copy at the library.
Yes. Yes. I stumbled the heck over that one. So it's the Cutbank Big Fish Flash Fiction/Prose Poetry Contest. Can you say that 5 times fast?
I can't, I don't
No,
even know
same.
if I can say like it once.
I love the bookshelf back there, and a lot of what we talk about on the podcast is kind of what the really formative, transformative works that we read when we were kids into adolescence and beyond. I'd love to know, growing up San Antonio, right?
Yeah, San Antonio.
Great San Antonio, Texas. I'd love to know what you were reading. Was it monolingual? Was it all English? Was it Spanglish? Was it Spanish and English? And all, kind of what you're reading and writing. And also, are you a Spurs fan?
Oh, I was a Spurs fan for years and years, and my family will disown me if I say I'm not a Spurs fan anymore.
Okay.
I love Greg Popovich, and he's still there. So
Okay.
I
Okay.
love the Spurs in that regard, but I can't name all the Spurs right now. That would be a
No,
stretch for me. But
I gotcha. Fair enough. Fair
but
enough.
Sean Elliott for life. I often think about getting a Sean Elliott tattoo still. Um,
Yes.
yeah, Steve Kerr, just like a ton of Spurs
I
people
was
are
gonna
still
make it
my
like I was gonna make it like a stupid binary. I was gonna say like Tim Duncan or like David Robinson. Like why does it have to be either one? And I love the
right.
Sean Elliott. What a great. I mean Sean Elliott was a great one.
Yeah, I mean, Sean Elliott, I mean, growing up in San Antonio, I mean, I love books, but I can't believe I picked the Spurs first. But anyway, growing up in San Antonio, Spurs culture is just so infused in everyday life.
Mhm.
I have a relative who my husband Fernando says, like, does he own anything that doesn't say Spurs on it? And the answer is no. Everything is Spurs, Spurs
Wow.
t-shirts, Spurs, whatever. And growing up, everybody I knew was obsessed with the Spurs.
Hmm.
And even in my high school, we would learn about things and relate it to the Spurs. We were learning some types of shells and things in biology class, and the teacher said they're really small, like Sean Elliott's ears.
Wow. That's a great
Yeah,
simile and math and word problems. Oh my gosh.
yeah. So everything was Spurs all the time. So um, I'm still obsessed with sports and basketball and San Antonio things. But I can't say that I
Yeah,
watch the Spurs anymore.
it happens, right? I mean, the I feel like there's the little I know of San Antonio. There's a lot of similarities to Sacramento, where I'm from. Like, there's not. I mean, there's not a lot going on. As in, we're not a huge city. We don't have a million things like LA, and right. So, like, yeah, the Kings here are just it's everything. I don't know that I
Yeah.
ever had a math word problem based on the Kings, but same idea. Same idea. Yeah.
Yeah, so Spurs were huge. I developed into a Spurs fan after I was a reader. So
Hmm.
uh I spent a lot of time on the west side of San Antonio with my grandmother and my great aunt and my grandfather. And to be honest, the first time that I really spent like encountered books or anything was at garage sales and like flea
Mm-hmm.
markets and things like that. And so I can't say that I was a big reader until around second or third grade. It was just like whatever we found at the flea markets is like,
Sure.
yeah, we'll take this home and figure it out. And sometimes it was like a bust, and sometimes it was great. And so my great aunt would buy like a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, but I was too small to read it, so she would read it to me.
Oh wow.
So books like that were my kind of introduction to stories. But once I could read on my own, I really took off. It was I remember the moment it happened. I struggled a lot until the summer of fourth grade. It's not the summer, the Christmas break, right
Okay.
before like we had to go back. And I read a Judy Blume book called Just as Long as We're Together,
Mm,
and everything opened up in my mind and I was in the book. And after that, I just wanted to read everything by Judy Blume,
wow.
and then a bunch of Nancy Drews.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that was kind of my real introduction, like reading on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then, by the time I got to high school, I was like everyone, like really into Sylvia Plath.
Okay.
And I really got into Muriel Spark, who I'm still obsessed with, the Scottish writer,
Mm,
and just kind of the staples, like very predictably Salinger.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I read a lot of, like, I would walk into Barnes and Noble and just buy what was ever like on the contemporary table. So
Mm-hmm.
I read Susanna Kaysen and like whatever was kind of popular.
Yeah. Yeah. Did is there any psychology to be had there? Did you feel like you kind of gravitated more towards like escape type of books and like, or not even like in a negative way, like, oh, I can travel the world, I can be in Scotland, I can be in, Australia, or do we more like into realism, or was it kind of all the above?
I really liked being transported
Mm-hmm.
um,
That's the word, yeah.
to different countries, and so I really wanted at some point to recreate the magic that was happening when I was reading. And so I started, like, the first stories I ever wrote were set like at boarding schools and these places that I considered really
Mm-hmm.
exotic, even though to most people they weren't exotic, they were just kind of ho hum. But to me, like, what was a boarding school like, and
Yeah.
what was it like to have velvet furniture, and all these things that for me were kind of like way beyond my everyday life. So I
Mm-hmm.
started writing things like that because I just thought that was so mesmerizing. So it was a lot of transport, like transporting me out of my real life
Mm-hmm.
things. Um, yeah, that's what I just felt it was like, like the Narnia in a way, just going
Sure.
somewhere magical.
Sure. I'm actually good. I'm actually kind of saying sure, sure, and nodding. I actually don't know a lot about Narnia. I'm embarrassed to say, but I know the basics. You know,
Yeah.
if you can ask me any more deeper questions about Narnia, I'm gonna be stumped. But well, yeah, I think growing up reading, Tobias Wolff was one of the main reasons that I do this
Mhm.
podcast. The title and everything is derived from that. But man, like so much about boarding schools. Like, do people actually go to? Is that like a real thing? Is boarding? You know what I mean? Like, what are these? I guess on the East Coast, maybe more than anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I romanticize boarding school so much, and I am still a sucker to this day for boarding school novels. I'll read any boarding school novel. I just love them so much. And the first story I wrote, yeah, definitely took place at a boarding school,
Mm.
and was kind of like elite private school. Like, what will
Yeah,
happen
yeah.
over like this holiday break?
Well, I guess I take that back. I guess isn't Wednesday like the Wednesday Adams? Like, isn't that kind of a boarding school? And is she like in the series and stuff? So I guess boarding school fiction or boarding school stories are still alive and well, maybe. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think in a sense it's somewhat related to the campus novel,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense. And I'm also a sucker for campus novels, and
Okay.
maybe I wrote one, I don't know. Um, so yeah, I think there's definitely a link between like being secluded and like no one really overseeing what's going on, and
Sure.
there's some shenanigans and stuff.
Shenanigans. There was at least one leafy New England campus mentioned in Math for the Self-Crippling, right?
Yeah.
At least one. So there you go. Probably related to some real life events, which we'll talk about in a minute. Maybe. I wonder just about, in all the myriad ways that we are made up of cultures, subcultures. I wonder, if you felt represented in what you read. If so, how so? If not, did that matter? Did you not necessarily look for that until later on? It wasn't something you were thinking about. How did representation work in what you read?
Yeah, well, to go back to one of your questions that I think I kind of skipped over, I grew up in a household, well, with my parents, we spoke mostly English, but with my grandparents, and I spent a lot of time with them, they spoke to me in Spanish and I replied in English. So I
Mhm.
was receptive to the language,
Sure.
not completely expressive in the language.
Mm.
I think I heard that when you interviewed the author of, was it Brotherless Night? I think she used
Hmm.
the that term too.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I was completely in my head, Spanish made sense and everything like kind of filtered in through Spanish in many
Okay.
ways. But at school, everything was in English. But I remember distinctly in third grade when someone would ask me something and I would say, well, let me tell you in Spanish, and I'm not sure how to say it in English. Um, and so there were times where my brain just like only knew the Spanish
Sure.
or like could only retrieve it immediately in Spanish. And then I would kind of fumble around. Like yeah, like I think like house robe. I didn't know what a house robe was. I was just like, it's a kimono.
Uh,
And people were like, you wear kimonos, like Japanese kimonos in your house? And I'm like, no, but like I didn't know, what a house
wow.
robe was. Um, so I didn't really think about representation in books when I was first reading. And in fact, I felt like, some of the Judy Blume books were, like, oh, I am worried too about like being in school and friends. So I did identify with that. But in terms of the cultural stuff, I didn't see myself. In fact, the first time, and I didn't see myself like at all, like culturally speaking. And then like for the longest time, I thought like I was some kind of freak because I had a name that no one else had,
Mm.
first name and last name. And so the way that I kind of carved a space for myself is I decided I was going to buy every book at the bookstore written by someone named Ursula. So I went and bought Ursula K. Le Guin books. I went and bought Ursula
Uh-huh.
Hagee books. I bought like anytime something said Ursula on it, I bought it because I was
Yeah.
just like, I need a connection to these books somehow.
Uh-huh.
And so that's kind of like how I started thinking like maybe I could be a writer because like the word Ursula's on a book.
Whoa.
Um, but then I guess by the time I was in high school, my no problem.
So, I mean, you probably lucked into some good stuff with Ursula Le Guin, right?
Oh, I have to be honest, I didn't read it for years.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
I just held on to it. And that was just like, okay, it's here. And here's, a book that one day I might read.
Looks nice on
Um,
the bookshelf or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It was totally a
Aesthetic.
poser. Yeah. But by the time I was in high school, my aunt was really a really big Sandra Cisneros fan. And
Uh-huh.
Sandra Cisneros lived in San Antonio.
I was
And
gonna say, I know
so
she writes about Chicago, but she has family in San Antonio, or she lived there for a while. Yeah, yeah.
she lived there for a while, and so she did readings. So I was able to go to at least one or two of her readings when
Yeah.
I was in high school, and those really were beautiful readings, and they made a really big impact on me. And she was a
Mm.
really generous reader and writer, and she dedicated books to me, like not
Uh-huh.
like
Right.
you know, but she signed them. She was very personable,
Yeah.
and it really made a difference in my life.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it wasn't just a person whose picture was on the back cover. It was actually a person you met and was actually alive and right. Who you
Yeah,
who you knew. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, she was alive and I read her stuff and I liked her stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't just, a book on the shelf. It was a real connection. Some of her work, I have to admit, was a little mature. I think My Wicked Wicked Ways came out, which is a poetry collection, kind of like
Okay.
feminist, kind of sexy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very young. So I think that was a little mature for me, but I
Sure.
still read it. I still liked it. I'm sure that I would relate to it a lot more these days.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but she was a really important figure in my life. And, um, the fact that, like you said, she was alive, I saw her, that kind of made the profession of writing just a little
Right.
more real for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Holy Night or One Holy Night was one of her stories that I still remember. That was like it. I think it's from Woman Hauling Creek, and that was we read it in the class, and it was like, wow, you can do this in a story, huh? It was just
Yeah.
like, yeah. like really understated and kind of like not like an O. Henry ending, but just like a kind of a shock to the system in a great way. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. I'd love to know about kind of the writing side of things, how the love of reading and Ursula Le Guin to Cisneros and all Nancy Drew and all that, how that led to, or maybe in high school or college, how you kind of said like I can do this writing thing, or you got some really good feedback from someone you respected, or how you became a writer.
So I think I just, like I said, wanted to emulate that kind of magical feeling that I got from books, and I wanted to pass that along to other people. And I started by writing poetry in high school. And of course, it was really bad for many, many years. But thankfully, nobody discouraged me. My teachers were very kind,
Mm,
and I kept at it. And I found it very fun to I don't know, to express myself in, not just like, oh, this is a poem about the moon or flowers,
mm,
but to really grapple with things like, self-acceptance. And um, I was vegetarian at the time. I really wanted to write about that. It seemed important to me. And so kind of like, heavier topics, I guess, for a teenager. So I found poetry to be a really good vehicle for my thoughts.
mm,
And it really fostered my love of language. I had some supportive, I guess, teachers who were like, you should enter a poetry contest. And I started doing that, and I started having some of my poems published locally in San Antonio. Um, I guess starting maybe like sophomore year or so. And
mm,
then junior year, I had more poems published. And then by senior year, my mother encouraged me to enter this poetry contest that she's found in the San Antonio Express News.
mm.
And I naively thought, oh, it's just a bunch of kids like in high school in San Antonio doing poetry stuff. I should just send some poems in. So I did. And then I got a letter in the mail saying from KLRN, which is the PBS station in San Antonio.
Whoa.
And they were like, we like your poems. We invite you to come read them this day. And I thought, oh, it's like not an anthology. It's not like, something. So then I found out this was like adults from like all over the country were coming to read their poetry, and they had selected me, and I was the youngest person. And I thought, this is wild. I need Xanax.
Ah,
and and yeah, so it kind of started that way. I was like reading my poetry in front of a television audience.
whoa.
Um, yeah, so that happened by the time I was a senior in a high school. So um, that was a really big confidence boost to
Mm,
know like somebody thought there was some merit in this writing. Somebody thought this was kind of interesting. And I got, lumped together with like real writers, like people from all over. So I thought, yeah, I'm definitely going to pursue this.
shout out to I'm a writer, but I feel like I heard some of that story on I'm a writer, but
Yeah, maybe,
yes, yes,
probably.
yes. I was having deja vu. So when you said you did it on the PBS station, was it live? Was it recorded? Like live, like on the air right now?
No, I think they added, like, I think there were
Yeah.
like, they built in commercial breaks or whatever, because it was just like, spooling in an auditorium or whatever. Like,
Oh, sorry, but what an experience, right? I mean, I always feel like, like as a coach in sports, hey, play against players who are better than you, play against people who are older than you. Like, what an experience for you to be there with like the adults. We talking like
oh,
grandmas
yeah.
and grandpas, maybe?
I mean, so like I didn't know who everyone was, obviously, and there was no internet then. I'm so old that like I
Uh,
couldn't Google these people to figure out who they were. It was just like when the person who won the night or whatever, right?
yeah.
Like um I found out he was like a 25-year-old like adjunct professor in Chicago. And I was like, what? So insane. But yeah, I mean, it was a really affirming experience. I mean, totally
Yeah.
nerve-wracking, totally like I was out of my league. Like I didn't know how to perform poetry. I just knew how to write it in my room
Mm,
and like send it to newspapers and stuff. I was not by any means like professional or even,
mm,
I didn't have those aspirations to be on TV reading my poetry, but it happened.
mm.
And I'm grateful for it.
That's so cool. Did you have trouble fitting your head through the doorway afterwards? I mean, were you a little bit overconfident? Nah. Affirming is the word
No,
you said. Affirming. Yeah.
yeah, it was affirming. Like there was no way that I thought that I killed it and like was the best person there by any means. It was also very humbling because, I saw what it was like when real professionals had prepared and,
Mm.
delivered a really incredible performance. It's really different for someone standing there and reading their poetry and someone kind of like bringing it to life.
Yeah, the whole idea of like you're gonna probably run faster if you're running with somebody or against somebody than you would on your own, right? Like step your game
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Man. So you were talking about like starting with poetry, really, which I think so many of us have or did. I was just at my daughter's conference, and she's in second grade, and they're writing. She shared a poem with me. I'm like, oh, awesome. They're learning about onomatopoeia and alliteration, all this cool stuff. Um,
Amazing.
I know, right? But
Yeah.
so like, I kind of wonder how you for math for the self crippling, which is labeled as stories. But I
Mhm.
saw like that in an interview you did, you kind of you called it like flash fiction slash prose poetry,
Mhm.
and it does kind of straddle those lines, right? So, you're writing before this, like, you got in the 2015 long list for the best American short stories. Like, have you been kind of going back and forth with poetry and fiction? Do you have some work that's like fiction, like literary fiction or whatever someone would call it? Or do you feel like you're kind of in those in betweens?
I think naturally I am a long form writer.
Mm-hmm.
It's how I mean, other than starting with poetry when I was younger, once I transitioned in college to writing fiction, I became obsessed with like short stories and, and I've always wanted to read novels and memoirs and whatnot. And so I've been obsessed with lengthy things. And when I went to graduate school, I thought, okay, I have to write lengthy things. Um, and so a lot of my writing is, you know, short stories that are 12 pages
Mm-hmm.
to 25 pages.
Sure.
Um, but I never really spent that much time with poetry afterwards, to be completely honest, not after high school. I wrote a couple poems in my 20s to like
Mm-hmm.
people I was crushing on, and then I would hand them to them or email them to them.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't something that I actively pursued anymore. But I think that the love of language and kind of that obsession with, individual words and the arrangement of them is something that never really left me. And so when I decided to write flash fiction, uh, it did start to feel a little bit like poetry. But obviously the line breaks are different and, it's prose.
Mm-hmm.
But that attention to detail and, really being
That's what it
obsessed with
is.
the
Yeah.
sound and kind of the metric of it, just like kind of kicked back up into a higher gear.
Yeah. I don't listen to a lot of it, but like, I don't know if you ever heard like the Moth Radio Hour. Like,
I've heard it, yeah, a couple times.
right? I feel like these would be, that's the thing about this collection is so cool is that like there's a lot of them, if not all of them, that are standalone, but there's definitely the through lines, and it really goes together so well from basically young girl to an adult. It does go chronologically for the most part, so it works the parts, but the parts are definitely what is it? The whole is worth more than the parts kind of thing. I appreciate that. What were some of those maybe stories that really inspired you, challenged you, captivated you? Talking about the short stories that you've read through the years, or even the
It's a good
writers.
question. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I think, I mean, there's some short stories that I read that I'll never forget because I had never read anything like them, like
Sure.
Bartholomew, the school. I read
Uh-huh.
that and thought, like, wow, that is insane. Like, how does somebody do that?
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily a style I thought I wanted to imitate. I read Tobias Wolff, obviously. Um, and then when I was in graduate school, well, when I was in high school, let's back up. When I was in high school, I really liked Amy Bloom.
Mm,
And she's now kind of more of a novelist, but at the time, she had a book, I think it was called Come to Me or something like that. There was a couch on the cover. And that was a really important book um, in my life. And then when I went to college, of course, I got obsessed with Jesus' Son.
mm,
And I read a lot of Best American short story collections. Um, so there were quite a few stories. Jeffrey Eugenides' Airmail for a long time
okay.
was my favorite short story. And then, of course, I read Sandra Cisneros and she has a short story. I don't know, I don't remember the title of it anymore, but it's basically like the narrator and her lover sitting in a car in front of a panaderia just eating bread.
Mm,
I don't know if you remember this one, but
I don't know
anyway,
that
that
one.
one, like, I still think about that one all the time because the whole story was just like how much they are, just eating, but there's so much pleasure just from the act of eating and being together in this
Mm,
little space,
mm-hmm,
like while looking at this bakery. So that was a really important story in my life. Um, and then later, like Roberto Bolaño became really important, and I
mm,
love his stories. Last Evenings on Earth is one of my favorite short story collections. Um, so there have been quite a few, but I have to say, like, the ability to impact me through a short story doesn't necessarily translate into something that I then write or
yeah.
imitate. It's just like, oh wow, I wish I could do that. And sometimes I'll attempt something similar, and other times I'll just let it be and be fascinated and
Mm,
remain the fan.
mm-hmm. I appreciate that. So Math for the Self-Crippling is, what, 52, 54 pages. They're vignettes. Is that safe to say? They're stories?
Sure, there's
All
stories,
the
they're
above.
vignettes. It's a, I guess, novel and flash or
Novel.
something.
Yeah, okay. Where does it where does it sit in the like in the bookstore?
Oh, I don't think it's at bookstores. I mean,
Okay.
not a lot of them. It sits, actually, it's at McNally Jackson in New York right now, and I think it
Yeah.
sits in the chapbook
Okay.
section. And then I
Yeah.
think at Powell's it sits in like the independent book section, like
That
the
makes
small
sense.
press books.
That makes sense.
So it is in a couple bookstores, but yeah, I think it depends on the bookstore to where
Mhm.
they want to place it.
In one of the interviews, you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong here, more or less that like so many people assume this book to be autobiographical, and more so because you're a woman, right? This idea that for whatever reason, women's work is often more times often assumed to be autobiographical. Does that seem to be true? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's this idea that women are just sitting writing their stories like verbatim, and that there's less of, maybe like a little less craft going on in
Uh-huh.
terms of the fictionalizing aspects.
There's a progression in the story. Again, there's some, a little bit of back and forth or flashback, if you will, but it's mainly pretty much a through line as far as chronologically. Did I don't know. I mean, did you write the book chronologically yourself? Was it kind of like plot first or themes first, or was it just like piece by piece, paso a paso, step by step?
It was definitely paso a paso.
Mm-hmm.
And I just gave myself little writing prompts and assignments. It was definitely not written in chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
It was definitely just like kind of these little experiments that I wanted to do. I had just graduated from getting my MFA,
Mm-hmm.
and I had two part-time jobs, and I was and my partner was getting a PhD, and I often spent a lot of time at the library of his school waiting for him to get out of class.
Mm.
And so I had these little bursts of like, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And so I would give myself a writing prompt and just kind of sit there and see what came. And sometimes it was really fruitful, and other times like, it was okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I really felt like I had nothing to lose because I didn't consider myself a flash writer. I considered myself long form. So it was really just kind of an amusement for myself
Mm.
that then became really meaningful. And I started to polish them, and I started to submit them. And then individually they started getting published. And then I thought, oh, maybe there's like a through line here. Maybe they're in conversation with each other and I can do
Mm.
something. And maybe there's a manuscript here. So it wasn't until, a couple of years later, maybe 3 or 4,
Yeah.
that I started to arrange them this way.
The first story is called Envelope First, 1953, and there's some beautiful imagery. There's some great phrasing. Hologram of boredom is one that stood out to me, but it's basically like a ring of adults is holding hands. There's candles lit. There's levitations. But the mother, I think it's the envelope. I think that's where the title comes from. Doesn't the envelope like levitate
Swish
according
off
to
a table.
according to the story? The mom of this story, the mom of the narrator, she refutes those levitations. She's like, nah, this, I don't think so. It seems to me like there's so much in this collection about what's the line? There was another line, I've written it down somewhere, I forget, but just this idea that not every story that's told as nonfiction is nonfiction. Kind of about, I guess, about who's telling the story and about elaboration and exaggeration. I wonder how that kind of fits into the collection.
That's a great question.
About truth, I guess.
Truth, yeah. I don't know. So it's an interesting question, especially because a lot of people think that, these stories are autobiographical, and it's like, well, I don't know how many letters have been floating around your house, but
Sure.
I think I think there's something beautiful about the imagination and something beautiful about I don't know, maybe there's some truth in stories that are unbelievable.